Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our IEEE EMBS Distinguished Lecture event for the fall semester. My name is Derek Joseph, and I am a fourth year studying bioengineering with a focus in cell and tissue engineering. I serve as the outreach chair for our chapter here on campus, where I am in charge of hosting the Distinguished Lecture events for undergraduate members. For today's event, our distinguished lecturer is none other than Dr. Michelle Johnson from the University of Pennsylvania. To give you guys some background on her academic achievements, she has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering in applied mechanics from the University of Pennsylvania, and she earned her PhD in mechanical engineering with an emphasis on mechatronics, robotics, and design from Stanford. She is now currently the Associate Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehab at UPenn, and at this university, she also helps direct the General Robotics Automation Sensing Perception Lab, otherwise known as GRASP, where her research is mostly focused on robotic rehabilitation to quantify upper limb motor function that is influenced by brain injury. For today's talk, Dr. Johnson will discuss the global future of robot-assisted neurorehabilitation in low and middle income countries. And from this conversation, we hope that you guys have a better understanding of how neural engineering and robotics play a role in society and how members can function better with the application of robotics to further assist with medical therapies. And before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping rules. We ask that you keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation. There will be a time slot for questions after. And if you are watching this video from the recording, we can also help direct questions that you have. Just reach out to me through my email on the website, and I will send those questions to Dr. Johnson. So that is all I have to share. And I will allow Dr. Johnson to take over and share her presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to being able to share the things that I work on and I'm passionate about with you guys. I'm just going to jump on in. A few financial disclosures, just in case I mention something that is being commercialized through the lab. There's a rehab care system and we're in the process of commercializing it. I want to talk about like the human robot neurorehabilitation and talk about it from the perspective of how we think about what they should be going towards in the future. And I'm going to talk about affordability and inclusivity and as a result and provide some case stories. Why is this an important topic? I think when we think about globally what's happening in terms of disease, communicable diseases, there are lots of, when you look at what's happening in high income countries like the US, or across the world, we see ischemic heart disease and stroke as some of the big number one killers as well as causes of disability, but we also see a lot of other types of systems as well. And one thing that's important to note is about these types of diseases that if you survive them, you're really gonna be ending up with some type of disability. And, diabetes, which is a non-communicable disease, might lead to amputations and blindness, and high blood pressure might lead to stroke, and a variety of other issues. And so how do we deal with the fact that there's a growing number of people with disabilities worldwide? And the fact that, COVID showed us that when the caregiver population doesn't grow as fast as the people who need help, you have a catastrophe at hand, right? And so we see that happening in rehabilitation is that the people who are skilled to take care of the people with disabilities, their numbers are either stagnating depending on where you live in the world or just not growing as fast. So that leads to this big gap in care. And as roboticists and engineers, we believe that technology can bridge this gap. And what type of technology we're talking about? Therapy robots, those are the main ones. But we also talk about assistive robots, but I think this focus today is mostly on the therapy robots. The idea behind therapy robots is to build engineering systems that can automate and deliver somewhat semi-autonomously a therapy to a limb or a joint. But we also want these systems to be able to assess levels of disability, and we want them to be effective at reducing impairment. And typically they're living in major hospital systems in supervised clinics. And our ultimate goal might be to try to think about, well, how do we make them more affordable and inclusive? In order to be able to even have that discussion, we need to understand a little bit more about like how we want to use these robots. And so a part of it is kind of imagining that therapists in the robot patient therapy paradigm, or the therapist patient paradigm, we want robots to come alongside the therapist or the person, the caregiver, and provide kind of an assistance in terms of the therapy. So if the therapist is functioning as a demonstrator to try to get like the patient to do something, that the robot is able to do that. And then when the therapist wants to observe the patient's movement, that maybe the therapist want the robot to do the demonstration, that the robot could do that, and being able to observe the patient perform. And then when the therapist wants to help the person's movement, do we have a technology that will help that and assist the patient to perform the function? There are robots out there, and I'm going to go through a quick smorgasbord so you see a variety of them. Here's an example of what I call the helper type robot, where it's basically attached to the person's limb in some manner, and it's allowing movement of the arm. We're programming it to apply forces, and we're programming it to move to support the movement of the impaired arm. Here's a kind of that demonstrator observer type robot. Maybe we've programmed it as engineers to demonstrate activity and movement, and to interact with elder patients or other types while they're doing exercise. But where are these robots? For the most part, most of the systems are in high income countries, and they're the yellow dots on this graph are areas where majority of the cluster of these rehabilitation robots are located. And when we think about middle income and low income countries, we just don't see as many as those dots. So there is a mismatch between the opportunity for this type of technology in terms of driving care, and in terms of making a difference between, for example, stroke survivors or people with spinal cord injury, et cetera, and where they're located in the world. And so a part of that is to think about, how do we make these systems more inclusive and more affordable so that everyone can benefit? And oftentimes that care gap that we were talking about is even more, they're much wider in these global areas. So how do I define affordability? Affordability is the extent to which something is affordable as measured by its cost relative to the amount the purchaser is able to pay. So in a sense that there are lots of types of robots, and if you're a wealthy hospital, you can afford, a very sophisticated robot system that costs $150,000, and that's fine because that's going to be affordable for you. But if you're a small hospital or a small nursing home in a place like Botswana, that $150,000 robot is way out of your reach, and so therefore you're not able to capitalize on that technology. But the need is quite there and quite graphic. So a lot of from a design point of view, the problem with many of these systems might be their mechanical complexity, their sizes, their masses, their high cost, and that then makes them kind of out of the reach for many of the places globally in low middle income countries. So how are potential strategies to reduce the cost to make them more global impact? We could use low-cost robotics and mechatronic systems. We can really start thinking through how do we get creative. There's a lot of people are thinking cheaper materials, soft robotics, really reinventing the way that we do robotics and the materials that we use. How do we leverage? And of course, as technology improves and as we make strides in the electronic industry and in the engineering, in the energy industry, we're going to have, the electronics are getting cheaper and cheaper and really enabling us to do more and more. Another thing is to maybe use several units, low-cost units, and try to reconfigure so that you're not just having one robot that you mean to do everything, but you may have a system of robots that can together, maybe they're simple separately, but together they may be able to do more. So I was going to talk through a couple of a case study on kind of thinking through this idea of affordability and inclusivity. So this, where we began, so I actually used to be at the Medical College of Wisconsin and Marquette University. Hey, Jim, I saw you. Oh, I didn't even, Jim, just saw him. Anyway, sorry, I didn't even see you. And there we started working with a colleague in Mexico that I met there, who then went back to Mexico. And one of the things she talked about in Mexico, she's in Chihuahua. And when she got there, she really expressed this issue. She's like, Michelle, the stuff that I got exposed to in Milwaukee really are hard to get in Mexico, and our need is quite great. So that's actually where another area where I began to kind of think through. And so we said, okay, well, stroke as an example system, stroke is, major cause of disability. Most stroke survivors end up with upper extremity type issues, lower extremity issues, as you can see from this pic. The issues could vary widely in terms from muscle weakness to spasticity to impaired coordination, posture. 75% will have motor impairments, 40% will have some type of cognitive impairment. And this is definitely one of the main areas or causes of disability in Mexico. So we started really small. She was like, how can we make things affordable? And we said, okay, well, the force feedback systems were do we have to have a robot was one of our first questions. Can we have a very simple system that could just help people play games, extra games? And this was kind of I worked with her then to develop this Mexican TheraDrive, we called it. And we then had a study. We were able to get a small grant from Mexico, and we placed this electrical mechanical type robotic systems, quote unquote, together with some relatively inexpensive electromechanical systems, like, for example, this FES system, a functional electrical mechanical system, and then this motor med system that was automating movement of the lower limb as well as movement of the upper extremity. And we put it together in this suite. And what our goal was that in a Mexican context, they couldn't afford the 150,000 robot, but this whole suite was for $29,000 or somewhere around there. If you want the exact numbers, you can go to the paper. But the whole idea there was, can we for a fraction of the cost of the typical systems, get out, some recovery in this paradigm. So we ran a study, and the study actually was very encouraging and showed that this distributed type of low-cost system was actually able to improve function. And so that led us to start thinking, well, maybe you don't have the luxury of a $29,000 system. Suppose we want to be able to put this system in an area like the rural part of Mexico. So we needed something even less expensive. And so we thought about, well, if we can manufacture something out of reasonable or very affordable parts, as well as configure it so that multiple robots can be on the same system, almost like this mini gym. And could that be a solution in the caregiver space? Another thing we learned was that those simple force feedback, while kind of neat and the idea was nice because they cost $100, they weren't really sufficient for the severe and the moderate functioning impairment persons with severe and moderate functional impairment. So that led us to say, okay, to develop a low cost, 1 degree of freedom robot we call haptic TheraDrive that would be able to be to support more severely impaired patients in terms of providing that upper extremity motion. And so with this system, we've been doing a lot more. The vision then was maybe this TheraDrive with assessment, novel assessment task games could deliver therapy. One of the key things, the idea was, because it was a compact system, you could move it around. You could change the angle of performance so that maybe now you're working the shoulder and elbow in this plane, but then you switch plane and now you're working the shoulder and elbow in a variety of planes. So the fact that it was a simple system was the concept. So then how did we get then to think about inclusivity? So let me define what I mean by inclusivity. Oftentimes, we are also defining very specific robots. We develop robots for like relatively one target audience, or we develop robots for people only with motor issues. But the reality says that most of our stroke survivors and most of our people with disability, they have, someone's in the waiting room, and I don't know if I'm the only person who can admit them. So just maybe Derek, you'll also need to pay attention. So the idea of then inclusivity here is this concept that people with disabilities are complex human beings with complex comorbidities. And most of the time, they're not just working with motor issues. They're working with cognitive issues as well, and other types of challenges that may kind of make their rehab not so perfect. So the idea of inclusivity, of providing equal access and opportunity, to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. And then one of the things we were thinking about was a lot of the high-end robots that we were doing, a lot of the studies were excluding people with any type of, for example, cognitive issues, or any type of really kind of more complex type challenges beyond the motor. And so as in a push towards inclusivity, we were saying, well, what do we need to do in order to include more of these folks with cognitive challenges that were more so than mild? And that led one of my PhD students to try to think through this issue of, one, we would need to be able to measure, and second, we would need to be able to adapt to treat depending on what type of combination of impairment someone had. We also started thinking about the HIV population, and this experience really was rooted in the fact that we wanted a group of patients that had both motor, that were could typically present with motor and cognitive issues. And so in addition to stroke survivors, and we also did HIV because we wanted to push the robot into Botswana, which is a sub-Saharan African country that we were developing collaborations with, and we wanted to use our haptic TheraDrive and experiment with affordability and applying rehab robot in this global space. So one of the key things that's true is the typical robot-assisted systems exclude cognition issues. But the truth of the matter is most stroke survivors, for example, are dealing with impairment in the upper extremity, as well as a significant portion are also dealing with cognitive impairment. So that's kind of why we landed on this motor and cog issue as an exemplar. And then also this was very common in the HIV population, which was a predominant issue in Botswana and sub-Saharan Africa, which is where we wanted to also work. So just a little bit about HIV. HIV used to be, deadly, but like many communicable diseases, after a while, we get a vaccine, we get some treatment processes, and then we're able to control. So now, instead of dying from HIV, a lot of people are living longer, and they're now becoming chronic. What we also know about this HIV population is that they seem to be at higher risk for strokes, for example, and that if the virus crosses the blood-brain barrier, then they present with both motor and cognitive impairments. So the idea behind my students' work was to say, okay, can we come up with robot-based metrics that can tease apart a complex presentation of motor and cognitive disability? And then if we can stratify this population, can we then tune we would then have a trajectory to be more inclusive. By then, the next focus would be, how do you best apply treatment to this group? So this, as a case study, then the idea then would be, how do we judge assess motor issues and cognitive issues? So consulting with our clinical partners, thinking about a battery of motor assessment tools that we typically use, and a battery of cognitive assessment tools that we typically use. The star was the haptic TheraDrive system, because we identified it as relatively low cost. And if we can do this well with a system of this nature, then that bode well for transferring to a more low and middle income environment. So the first task is this tracking task. So we wanted to come up with a series of assessment tasks. The first task had more motor content than cog content. And then quantifying the activity of this task. You can see an example here is the ideal trajectory is the dotted line, and being able to, this task and accuracy, able to kind of begin to separate those with more motor impairment from those with other types of impairment. And the other piece was to look at, then if you have these, if you have these metrics, can you then now predict or come up with a way that based on the robot metrics, you're able to then predict the true clinical nature. So that's important for us, because if we can do that, then maybe we have a placeholder that's quick, that's able to do quantifiable action. In this case, this tracking task has some predictability in terms of giving insight on performance error. And so that had good bode well for us. The other piece was coming up with a robot-based type cognitive task that was easy to administer, et cetera. And this, when I say robot-based, in that we pretty much just tied it to the Xers games, and pretty much it's a choice-based type task, a button press. The idea then is, if we can look at correct responses, a task that's only about cognitive issues, that would give us a cognitive memory attention type baseline. We also came up with a cognitive and motor assessment task. My student modified a Corsi block and the spatial span task that's typically given to people with cognitive issues, and added this motor component that could be used with the robot. And you can see from the task, the person they see an image of motion, movement, and then they're required to try to not just remember the movement, but also move the limb accordingly. One of the things that was found out was, is this task able to separate out people who had no impairment, people who had motor impairment alone, and people who had cognitive impairment alone, and then people with cog and motor impairment. You could see that there is people with no impairment typically can get, and on subsequent trials, they may be able to reach higher sequence length and remember higher sequence lengths. We see that people with both motor and cognitive impairment have trouble doing with their the sequence length and their memory. And then you can see motor and cog are kind of sitting on top of each other, meaning that people, even though someone might have good motor function, if they have moderate to high cognition, that cognition issue masks their motor performance. And so it appears that they actually have more issues than they really do. So one of the challenges then is, like, the role of cog is actually significant, because it can mask good motor performance if it's present. So then the question was, can you then stratify the population according to their motor and cog combinations? And if you can do that, maybe then it would lead to being able to adapt treatments on the fly in these types of settings. And what's true is, if you look at the grid of motor function and cog function, most of the time, our robots are functioning over here. People with moderate to high motor function at the top part, and people with high cog function. But there are lots of very few robots or systems that are functioning down here. And we were trying to figure out, well, what's the if we're in a low and middle income setting, how can we be more adaptive to this complex population? What we were able to see was that our metrics were able to actually, especially the spatial span one, give moderate predictability to the spatial span sequence length, especially gives moderate predictability to the MoCA, which is an executive function, essentially. The color trails, these are the clinical tools, and we showed that we had moderate predictability, and that's actually very encouraging. We also showed that we had a strong predictability for looking at the motor function of the box and block, which is a gross assessment of motor function. So I went through this a little bit too fast, is that I think with this, I think the upside of this was that, hey, with robotics and the right assessment tools, we might be able to potentially on the fly predict motor and cognitive performance, which then would tee us up for thinking about treatment that could have maybe, that would be adaptive to a little bit more complex presentation of motor and cog impairment. So putting it all together in terms of mixing now inclusivity with affordability, we have a venture that we're doing in Botswana. So we set up a robotics lab there. And the goal was to look at HIV and stroke, and to put to test whether our rehab care system with the haptic robotics could actually, one, do measure and one, be usable in a place like Botswana, where it's the 4th highest prevalence of HIV. 2 occupational therapists, for example, in the main referral hospital that has 642 beds, and about 1/3 of stroke survivors will also have HIV. So this is putting it to the test. The need for a reasonable costing robot, and the need to serve both a HIV population and a stroke population. The HIV population, from an assessment standpoint, in Botswana, most people with HIV and impairment status goes undiagnosed with no rehab. Stroke, most people that have a stroke will have not have access to therapy, and would go basically resulting with much more complex type issues and worse outcomes than, for example, someone in America. So just to present to you, Botswana, that's Southern Africa, right above South Africa, sandwiched between Namibia and Zimbabwe. We developed a collaboration there with the University of Botswana and the local hospitals that are there, because we wanted to basically look at real world deployment and what are some of the issues that may affect the global future of kind of using robotics across the world, not just in high income places or places that can afford it. So we had the objectives of, can develop the therapy system there? Can we assess patients with both HIV and stroke? And can we begin to figure out how to support training of engineers and people with rehab to be sensitive to being able to design for rehab populations? So a lot of times the misnomer is to think that in many of these places, the reason why robotics doesn't exist because they don't have enough engineers, or they don't have the smarts or those types of things. That's actually not necessarily true. There could be a resource limitation in that they may not have the engineers. But what I think is often happening, for example, in Botswana, is the engineers are directed away from like rehab, in that sense that they're fixing equipment, but they're not focused on designing and developing and treating. And one of our goals there is to try to build a generation of engineers and clinicians who can actually develop and design tools like the haptic third drive or other types of neurorehabilitation tools so that rehab robotics can be global. This is an example of the system that you saw in the lab that we've deployed. We have two of them, one in two different hospitals there. And the goal is we've been using these systems to collect data on HIV and stroke. And we've been collecting usability and feasibility data. And I think when we think about the global future, we also need to think about, is the stuff usable? People complain even presently in high income countries about the robots that we deploy to hospitals, that they're not really usable by clinicians, that they require too much work, that it doesn't fit within the normal operation of clinical care. And I'm over the last 20 years, I've seen that get better, but that is still an issue, making systems that can be globally usable. One of the things we encountered in Botswana is making the system so that it could be globally usable by people who don't necessarily speak English as a proper first, like a first language for their country. Or in Mexico, can we transfer this idea, if we develop in the US, can we transfer the knowledge to Mexico? And yes, we can, but there's a need to develop things within Mexico or within Botswana, and whether the cultural differences that we encounter make an impact on the robotics and how people perceive the extra games, for example, or the system. We need to be able to understand that. And I can say definitively, yes, culture makes a difference in how people respond to the robotics, respond to the therapy. Language makes a difference to even say whether the assessments that we developed in one setting will transfer to another. So these are, I think, to make robots really impactful in terms of affordability and inclusivity, we need to also consider culture, resources, and the way engineers and clinicians interact. So this, the cognitive assessment happening there in on the left, that's in my lab, and on the right is in Botswana. So being able to translate the system in both places was quite a feat for us. Another thing that we've been, with some colleagues in Italy, been experimenting is with that whole idea of reconfigurability, to be able to take simple modules of a system and then stack them together to make more complex systems. That's another way to deal with affordability, and that we're also experimenting with. So I think the key takeaways in terms of global impact, I think we need to think about affordability. And remember the definition, it's what is affordable given the person's context, right? And so I think a key that we've discovered in Mexico and in Botswana is developing robots needs to be a collaboration. It needs to be, especially if you're coming and alongside and you're not from that country, it needs to use in-country labor to reduce cost, in-country materials and supplies. Just an anecdote, we were in Botswana and we brought over our force sensor that we had designed for the handle of the robot. The force sensor broke, and we could not find anywhere in the major city of Botswana, or even that online, that we would allow us to get this system in country. Regionally wasn't there. We had to ship these systems. That led us to a design change, and then led me actually to sponsor a group of Botswana, which is the plural for people in Botswana, engineers specifically to redesign the system, thinking only of materials or using only materials and supplies that could be sourced within the African context. Why is that so important? The cost to import those sensors were ridiculous. and that is at the issue here of what then challenges the whole concept of affordability. Layering systems and allowing for reconfigurability, I think is also a good way to think through how to make that a reality. I think the challenges and opportunities are varied. Rehab is complex, and I think the goal of inclusivity is challenging because we're just talking about stroke, but if your population was a spinal cord injury, there might be, if you're trying to treat the entire spinal cord injury population, there is such a variety there that, to really be effective and inclusive as engineers, we really need to collaborate with our clinical partners in order to really think through how do we make robots accessible to the diversity of spinal cord injury population. It's even more important in a global setting because oftentimes the hospital, the community center in these environments don't have the luxury of buying a separate robot for each issue or a separate robot for different levels of function. That's just not realistic, especially when the budget is low and the resource is small. So how do we then allow for developing robotic systems that can, one, maybe tease out different levels and maybe adapt itself to a variety of different challenges in terms of assessment, in terms of therapy, that I think that is important. How do we develop robots that can hit multiple populations? So that you're not like, oh, this is only for stroke or this is only for X, but that in a very small resource setting that only have X dollars to buy one system, that they'll get the better bang for their buck. And I also think that as we think about the future of rehab, we also need to explore how and what are all the barriers to implementation. I mean, some of the barriers are cultural. Some people resisted, some people embraced us. Yay, we're excited that you're here. And some people were suspicious of us because remember, sometimes in the issue of colonialism, a lot of people had, well, are you coming to take instead of to give? So there are lots of barriers to implementation that are not just mechanical or engineering in thinking, but it's also cultural. It's like learning how to layer our design and our engineering on top of the cultural challenges, on top of like political issues, and on top of, not just on top of like resource issues. Another thing is thinking about exploring capacity building. I think a big barrier to that might impede robots becoming global is dealing with low resource, like the low numbers of clinicians or the low numbers of engineers, and then thinking through how do we, for example, in Botswana, in America, we're used to having the discipline of physiatry, which is the rehabilitation medicine doctors that are designed and trained to treat people with disabilities. There are zero physiatrists in Botswana. So people with disabilities are treated by family medicine docs who are quite competent neurology docs. And the discipline of disability and treating that context is actually not very well known. So building capacity, I think, has to come from not just from an engineering perspective, but from the other perspective as well. One of the things that I did while we were in Botswana, we worked closely with the local engineers and our engineering partners to begin to teach the engineers there about rehabilitation engineering, about rehabilitation robotics, about how to think through and problem solve and design and do scientific investigation with these types of technology. And I think that's the capacity building thing that actually comes along with wanting to open up rehabilitation robotics to be more inclusive and to be more global and more affordable. So just want to acknowledge lots of partners and people working with us to realize this, to acknowledge the IEEE as a distinguished lecturer. I thank you for inviting me, to acknowledge my lab and those that have supported the work that we do in terms of student work. And we'll stop there. And we have time for questions. And even despite the challenge of getting started, we were able to finish on time, right, Derek?
Yes, I'm very thankful that this event turned out the way it did. And I'm very thankful that you were able to come stop by. So huge shout out to you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm sure everyone in the Zoom call has enjoyed learning something about your work, your hard work, I should say, in robotics with treating therapies in the world. I would like to open up the floor to any questions that anyone has for Dr. Johnson. You can also ask your questions in the chat, and you can directly ask me or Dr. Johnson as well.
So there is a question in the chat, I think from Katarina. I was wondering, what was the most surprising response to rehabilitation robotics from patient, clinician, engineers you've experienced when working with individuals from a different culture? Great question. I have anecdotes, but I'll tell you one anecdote. So when we got into Botswana, while we were surprised, because English is one of the main languages in Botswana. And so, so we didn't anticipate that we'd have kind of any issues of transfer, because a lot of people consume, global information when they're watching TV. Anyway, when we set up the robot system and we tested our first patient, with technology, it didn't work well the first time. And we were like, oh no. And luckily though, our first patient or first user was a soldier who had a stroke, and he was quite patient. And he said, I said to him, when we were beginning the assessment, we were like, oh, you're actually the first person in Botswana to use this robot. And then I didn't think much of it. And then we went through, got it fixed. He was able to run some of the sessions. And he said, because we had difficulty, we had to invite him back. And we thought he wouldn't come back because, sometimes people get turned off when there's a problem. And he was like, I want to come back. And then we heard later that he tweeted, I'm the first person in Botswana to use a robot. And so in that sense, that was actually quite pleasant. There was definitely an excitement around it, but not everyone is. We did encounter some clinicians who were quite suspicious. They were like, are you coming to take our jobs? But we get that in the US as well, where people assume that when we introduce technology into rehabilitation and into the clinical environment, that it might displace some jobs. And while it might change the way that you operate, especially in Botswana and some places in the world, we can't afford to displace jobs. We need to augment. And as I remind them, this is here to allow you to treat more people, allow you to do more, to allow you to not have to let your stroke survivors only get therapy once a month, which is what was happening in one of the major hospitals. You get discharged and you come back every month for a therapy session. We know that that's not quite effective, especially with stroke. This allows you to do more. So we get a mixed bag. Some patients are super excited. Some patients are like, I'm suspicious. And then the same thing with clinicians. Are there other projects? Okay, maybe. Are there other projects that you have worked on that might be interesting to hear about? Of course. But that's probably more time than I have. So maybe Derek has my contact information. If you're specific about something, feel free to email. We've been doing some work with infants and children. One of the things we want to do is thinking about like automated assessment, early detection of impairment in kids, and leveraging our work that we're doing in the US to serve, a more global population as well. I might have missed this point, but in terms of looking at both motor and cog, is the technology targeting restoring function to the stratum, the putamen and the caudate nucleus? If so, can you throw some light on that? So this is a good question. So you're getting quite specific, because what we're doing is just trying to assess initially kind of what if the person has motor and cognitive issues. And then one of the things that we're also trying to do with the clinical assessment tool is we realize that cognition is a huge domain, right? There are many, many subdomains to cognition. So what we realize is that we wanted to focus more on like for executive function, working memory, and attention, that area. So specific brain areas that might govern it is the next level. I actually am working with a colleague here who's a neurologist who's looking at whether, and many people have actually looked at this, is looking at TDCS, and but usually they're doing TDCS to a motor area. So we're looking at looking at using, like figuring out how to creatively treat the different types of combination of systems. Should we be looking at, like you mentioned, the caudate nucleus or the putamen? We've been looking at the right prefrontal, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as maybe a potential starting place to think about working memory and attention and spatial memory. So we can't totally look at the whole brain, that's true, but I think the key thing is being able, if we can narrow down what's going on, could we come up with superimposing on robotics some additional low-cost type technologies? There was another question. Would you have thought of possibly making a mobile unit? Yes, that comes up all the time. This idea of how do you reach people in rural areas or reach people where they actually live. And one of the major things that I found in Mexico and in Botswana, and I dare say in many low and middle income countries, is transportation issues. A lot of patients, once they get discharged from the hospital, they often live very, very far and they can't access it. And this is more often the case than none. And it's transportation issues because of affordability, being poor, as well as just because they live so far from the main city. And so the mobile unit comes up a lot. It always is the question is who pays for that? How does that work? We've imagined it, and it gets into kind of a little bit, when I start getting into global work, as a scientist, I'm like really interested in answering questions, but I realize that as you start delving into these kind of, transfer areas, you start dealing with these other systems and complications and issues that may not necessarily be in my primary wheelhouse. So I think these issues have come up when we talk to like the Ministry of Health in Botswana, when they go, well, how do we, if we wanted to incorporate this going forward, what's the practical way to do that? So these are real questions and that we're struggling with. I know we have to stop. It's 3 o'clock, hard stop. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. And please, if you have any questions, Derek knows how to reach me.
And one last note, the meeting will be recorded for everyone who wants to access it later on. And we will post the link to the video on our YouTube channel this upcoming weekend. And I just want to give a quick thank you to all of you guys for coming on to our Zoom call for today. And I apologize for the tech problems in the beginning, but I'm really glad that we were able to host the event for today. And I want to give a huge shout out to our board. They worked super hard. It wasn't just my efforts in organizing this event. Haley, our former distinguished lecturer event outreach chair, helped me out a lot with this. It was a hard time to get used to on top of my busy schedule. And I really appreciate all the efforts from the marketing chair and the secretary, so Maria and Mary Ashley. They did a really great job reaching out, and along with the other board members for giving their suggestions and advice. But again, thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Take care.
Take care.